Okay, this morning I've chosen for us to look at Matthew 21, a little parable Jesus tells. So I want us to look at Matthew 21, 28 through 32. And starting a kind of subject / discussion that probably will carry on for a few weeks. So here's the little parable. Matthew 21, 28. What do you think? A man had 2 sons, and he came to the first and said, "Son, go work today in the vineyard." And he answered, "I will not." But afterward he regretted it and went. The man came to the second and said the same thing, and he answered, "I will, sir." But he did not go. Which of the 2 did the will of the Father? They said, "The first." Jesus said to them, "Truly I say to you that the tax collectors and prostitutes will get into the kingdom of God before you." So here's a little parable Jesus tells about a man and his 2 sons. In some ways, it's a false dichotomy. Can anyone think of why it's a false dichotomy? And this is a side point.
Because it did the opposite.
Well, yeah, I mean, he poses 2. A dichotomy is where 2 things are opposing, that you kind of propose this versus this. The reason it's false, and I'm not saying Jesus' point is false, I'm saying this is just a point about when someone sets up an argument, a reasoning. The weakness with all dichotomies is, have they named all the possibilities? When you say this or that, one of the questions you need to ask yourself is, are there other options besides the this or the that? And you'll find a lot of times there are other options. So why is this a false dichotomy? Only in that sense. But what are the other options?
They said yes, and they did it.
Yeah, it's like you set it up like those are not the God. Jesus, we want to be the one who says yes and then does it. See, you set up 2 options, those are not the only, because you could also say no and don't. I mean, there's 4 options, and you're only naming 2 of them, Jesus. So someone could complain that you're saying that to say no and to do it is better, but is it not worse still than to say yes and to do it? And that would be true. But his point is not. Is the boy who says no and then does it the best of all possible ways to respond to the Father? He's not alleging that. So it is a dichotomy. He sets up 2 options for the purpose of making his audience think. And he's not naming the other options because they're irrelevant to the point he's making. So that's a side issue, but it's very important. As we listen to what people are telling us, we need to recognize, are they setting up false dichotomies? Have they postulated options that are not the only 2 options? Are they correct in saying it's this or that?
In politics, yes.
Yeah, well, I'm alluding to such things, right? You find that there's a lot of poor argumentation out there along that basis. But Jesus he's making a point, and he does this a lot. Can you think of other places where he'll set up things in opposition? And they're often kind of false in that they're overdrawn.
In a way, you could do a prodigal son, because you could have a prodigal son that stays with him and is a faithful son.
Yeah.
I'm saying it's a simple.
No, that's true, yeah.
I was thinking the other side. The son's not resentful of when they killed the fatted calf for the son that didn't.
Yeah. Again, that story sets up, again, 2 sons and a tension there, and the listener is to make a choice, right, and see themselves in that story. But again, it's not all the possibilities. But what about even when Jesus says something like, you cannot serve God and mammon? It sounds like a stark either or. And it kind of is. But to serve God is to find a place of how to deal with the world's things. Because if you listen to it just kind of literally, well, I've either served God or I serve wealth. And so I guess if I'm going to serve God, I must be destitute to prove I'm not serving God. Or you could say, where Jesus says, unless you hate father or mother, sister or brother, you cannot be my disciple. I mean, he's setting up a dichotomy, which if we nuanced it, we would say, not just this simply either or, black or white. There's a nuance there, because actually, if I'm going to be his disciple, he tells me to honor my father and mother. So as soon as I choose to go on the discipleship side of the dichotomy, I now am a person who loves my father and mother, brother and sister. So you could argue you set up a false dichotomy, a choice. You either love me and hate your parents, or you love your parents and hate me. Okay, so my point, here's my point, is when Jesus sets up these dichotomies, he's making a point, but there's a more nuanced part of the whole story. He's only setting it up this way to make a point. If we were talking more broadly, we would say, yes, everything gets included, right? There is a place to love your father and mother and to be my disciple. Those are not in absolute tension, right? So he's making that kind of distinction. So here's this dichotomy about the two sons. So what do you think the point is? What are some things that we derive from this little parable about the point? The son who says, I will and doesn't, and the son who says, I won't and does. Why make that dichotomy? What point is he driving home?
Actions speak louder than words.
Yes, exactly. Jesus is a believer in the saying that actions speak louder than words. And his application of that is, surprise, surprise, the tax collectors and the prostitutes' actions are speaking louder. And you might say, but their actions are sinful. Maybe he's not talking about the tax collecting and the prostituting as the actions, but some other action. That despite the prostituting and the tax collecting, their actions are speaking louder than words. Any other thoughts about, I mean, that's a good way to sum up what he's saying. Any other thoughts?
I mean, it's not immoral, but I just thinking about it, it could have been both sons in the beginning, that was what they were going to do, and over time, change apart. And I know it's not setting up immoral, but it does mean that maybe the fact that we denied or decided we are not willing to do something, and we begin over time to understand it differently, is a good thing.
No, I like that. I like that, because I kind of put that down in some of my own thoughts. Even how I hear the parable, do I think that the son who said, I will, always knew, I'm not going to do that? Is he just deceiving his father? Or was that a genuine, statement, yes, I will, and then somehow failed to follow through? Because it's a parable, right? And he's obviously not talking literally about a son and whether he's going to go work in the vineyard that day. It's alluding to people and how they're living their lives in the presence of God as Jews, and Jesus is talking to them, how they're living their spiritual lives. So I'm going to say, yeah, I would think the way to read it is the son who said he would, it was a genuine, heartfelt, sincere belief on his part. But he didn't end up following through. Now, for whatever reason, you could say, oh, why did he end up not acting on that belief? Right? We don't know. But I think it's alluding to something, yeah, that there's a story as to what happened. And I think the way he applies it, the ones who said, no, I won't, and then later did, those are the tax collectors, the prostitutes, the sinners of their world. And again, there's a process involved. They're saying, I won't, was the flagrant way they chose to live against the Mosaic code, right? It was very deliberate. But something happens along the way, somehow, and they actually, well, as Jesus is talking about, they start welcoming the good news of the kingdom. And that becomes the actions that speak louder than the words. So another inaccuracy of the parable in terms of it's an illustration. In some ways you could say, well, it's always been action. Certain actions said no, and then the actions became yes, and certain actions said yes, and then the actions became no. In other words, it's not simply verbal versus doing something. As it's played out, what the tax collectors what they were doing was actions that said no. And he says, but it's in essence something that changes and becomes the true embracing actions of going into the vineyard, right? And doing the work of the Father. Okay. So here's why I bring this up. Is because I think this is one place that we can say Jesus believes that orthodoxy is not as important as orthopraxy. That orthopraxy takes precedent over orthodoxy. Now, what is orthodoxy? Orthodoxy in general usage means right teaching, right belief. Right? Do you have the right beliefs? Do you believe Jesus is the Son of God? Do you believe that, God is Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, one God, without separation, but without confusion, this mystery of a Trinity? A lot of, just in everyday usage, people would say those beliefs are orthodox. They're orthodoxy. Orthopraxy, as the praxy might suggest, it's right practice. And I think literally the word means right worship or right glory. But then you have to understand worship doesn't mean just what you do in a gathering on Sunday. That the idea of worship, it's how you act in the presence of God always. So orthopraxy is how do you worship God in everything you do. But in general terms, orthodoxy is right belief, and orthopraxy is right practice. And in my experience, most of the places I was, orthodoxy took great precedence over orthopraxy. Getting the right beliefs was far more important. Because we all knew that we would kind of, do our best about practice, but right beliefs were like mandatory. Practices were, well, we're working on that. Okay? Anyone else have that kind of experience in the life of the church? I mean, nobody's going to grill you on how well are you loving your neighbor, but they might grill you on, do you actually believe in the virgin birth? And if you don't, you're just not a Christian if you don't believe in the virgin birth. But what if we said, no, with Jesus, if you don't love your neighbor, you're not a Christian. It doesn't matter if you believe in the virgin birth and the triune God and that Jesus bodily rose from the dead on the third day. Those beliefs, those orthodox beliefs, are far less important than your practice. I think that would change a lot of things. In my experience, that would change a lot of things, and it seems to be what Jesus is on about. Doesn't seem like Jesus is all that focused on orthodoxy as much as he is orthopraxy. Okay, Don?
Could Jesus be referring to Israel, who said, yes, I will, and then they didn't?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, or the sons, yeah. Metaphors for Israel, not only just individuals. I think so. Just like I think the prodigal son is actually Israel, not just individuals. It's that Israel went into the far country. The whole nation did. He's talking about how they view their own history. It's about exile and return, and they were exiled in Babylon. You know, so he's somewhat telling that about the whole corporate experience of the nation. So yeah, I think you're right. This can be read very corporately rather than just individually.
A friend who died in a horrific accident, and he was not I don't really know what his beliefs were. They didn't go to church, and I don't think he grew up around or anything, but he was probably one of the kindest, moral, good people that you would ever meet. And I remember at the time, because this is 25 years ago, thinking, I'm worried about Steve.
Right.
And over time, I'm not worried about Steve at all.
No, I think, and you're hitting what I think Jesus is saying, and I'm going to take us through where Jesus keeps saying this, despite the kind of drum message that we hear drummed into us often in the modern church is, but there are statements of belief, right? Most churches, you go to their website, there's statements of belief. They'll make you sign those if you're going to work in the ministries of that church, right? It's all about orthodoxy. They don't make you sign a statement about your practice. They make you sign a statement about your beliefs. And maybe that church believes, we believe in, whatever. And it might be millennial ideas and the coming kingdom and the, indwelling of the Holy Spirit. And they'll have a whole list of things and they'll make you sign that. I remember Chris Lowry telling me that Drew, when he was at college, wanted to serve coffee to the students at the unnamed church there in Opelika where he was worshiping, and they wanted him to sign a statement of belief before he could serve coffee. The problem was he didn't know that he agreed with everything on the statement of belief. Well, obviously, you're not a good enough Christian to hand out coffee. The ironies, right? At least Drew knew the ironies were overwhelming, right? He didn't think, well, that's the way things should be. Drew had experienced Christianity in a way that says something's deeply wrong here. I mean, giving coffee is like giving a cup of cold water. It is the definition of what Christians do, but I can't do it unless I can sign off on this list of beliefs and statements. Something's amiss, right? But I love what Alan brought up. What if we, because we're habituated to the same context, and we tend to see people as Christians not because of the way they live, but because of beliefs they seem to hold or groups they identify with. But I don't think Jesus looks at it that way. What if we said anyone who's genuinely loving with the heart of Christ and the Spirit of God, no matter what ideas are in their head, they are more genuinely Christian in an orthopraxy. They might be saying no, but they're working in the vineyard, right?
I mean, isn't that what the Good Samaritan Jesus is saying?
Oh, yeah. I didn't even have that down as an example, but yeah, that's the whole point. The Good Samaritan is actually doing what is the ethic of Israel, and he's not an Israelite.
Yeah.
And if you know what the Samaritans believe, the Samaritans accepted no books beyond the 5 books of Moses. For them, the rest of it, all the prophets, were non-canonical. Those are the only 5 books they held as sacred. They did not believe that Jerusalem was the proper place of the temple, because if you only have those 5 books, there's no mention of Mount Zion. So I mean, any Jew would have said, this guy is, in terms of orthodoxy, he's so wrong. He doesn't believe that Isaiah and Jeremiah and Malachi and all these people were prophets of God, doesn't believe what they said. And yet Jesus is saying his practice trumps his beliefs. Yeah, I love that. Well, let's look at some more, because I want us to see how very, very common this is in the teachings of Jesus. It seems like he's always saying practice is more important than the beliefs in your head. I would also suggest that your beliefs in your head will be more affected by the practices you engage in than vice versa.
Say it again.
The beliefs in your head will be more shaped by the practices you engage in than the other way around. In other words, the way it actually happens, it's not that I get beliefs and then I put them into practice, is I start to practice things and then I start to think differently. That's actually the way we change. We don't change because we get educated. We change because we get habituated to things, and then it starts to change the way we think. So I remember things I've said here at DF. I said, we're not going to plan and implement. We're going to experiment and reflect. See how I just flipped it? I said, as a church, we don't have a plan that we're then going to implement, because everyone knows the best laid plans of mice and men. We know that phrase, right? You make a plan, the first thing you're going to have to do is modify it, because it never will work out like your theoretical plan was. The implementation will always mean adjustment. That doesn't mean don't have at least some sketch idea. That's what I call experimenting. So rather than have a plan and implement, the reality is we experiment. We try things and then we reflect. What did we learn? How does that change us? I think that's reality, right? That's actually what happens in our lives. Ken?
I also think that there's a correlation between who lives a repentant life, like we find in this passage. If your life is centered in orthopraxy, you're much more bound to live in a state of repentance than orthodoxy-centered type stuff, right? Because we've all had the experience of having more of a kindred spirit and a heart connection with those who are very in touch with their sin, right? Their actions. And you almost feel a more kindred spiritual bond with those people than maybe the person that can do theological gymnastics and talk slick about this, that, and the other of God. And there seems to be a correlation.
No.
So much in identity, we talk about how important identity is when other things start displacing our identity in God, right?
I like what you're saying. It makes me think the kind of pride of certainty might be more easily fallen into about orthodoxy matters than orthopraxy. Because if you're honestly trying to do things, you're probably going to be finding out, I do this imperfectly. But it's easy in our head with our beliefs to be so certain we've got it right and they're wrong. Well, get out there and try and do something and actually do it. And it's like, well, this is difficult and I'm not saying I'm doing it perfectly. So I think that can position us differently. Kind of a more humble, repentant, perhaps attitude, if the emphasis is on my own attempts to practice, because then I'll be experiencing my own failures. Because my practices always show up my inadequacies, right?
Well, you can change the churches because they don't have it down very well.
Yeah. Were you gonna?
I was just thinking that going along with what you were saying is, I think that's why he used You know, he didn't say those of you, as opposed to those of you that are trying real hard. He compared them with tax collectors and harlots, like, and in that time, those were, you know.
The worst of the worst.
The worst of the worst.
Yeah.
And trying to show them it's not about,
Yeah.
it's about your heart, it's about what you're doing and you're trying to do. But it's easy when it's, you know, if you just try a little harder, because that's kind of how I grew up.
Right.
The more you believe, the better you believe, and the more right you are in how you believe, then the better you are going to be, the more righteous,
Mm.
certainly self-righteous comes in there, or it did with me a lot. And that's a lot of my experience.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, tax collectors and harlots are the least likely to be self-righteous.
Yeah, they, Martin Luther made a statement when he was on trial about the prosecuting bishop or whatever that was trying him for heresy, and he said something about the harlots of the city. Well, at least they know they're sinners. You know, it's like the guy who's got me, who's holding me to account as being this heretic against the Roman Catholic faith, he doesn't even know he's a sinner. You know, he's like, the prostitutes of the city are in a better place than he is because at least they know they're sinners, right? So there's that kind of self-knowledge that like, they would not be trying to convict Martin Luther of heresy because they know they've got problems. The point was the bishop who's in court with me doesn't think he has any problems, right? And he's being convicted over orthodoxy, not orthopraxy. Right.
Greg, you make me think of things building up in the way of the Lord and shall not depart. A lot of us, you know, in today's culture, you know, at least my kids are not regularly is even too strong of a word, church, but I do know their heart, and I do know they're good people.
Ding.
That they are. You know, they do care genuinely about other people. I start to get emotional saying it.
That's what
And,
matters.
You know, we worry about that, okay, you know, I'd love to go with my granddaughter to her Sunday school class, and
Yeah.
throw her in there. But,
Yeah.
you know, right now in this season of their life, for whatever reason, that's, you know, that's not where it's at. And maybe some of the other parents here in the same circumstances, and all I'm saying,
Yeah.
just thinking about what you've just been talking about, it gives me comfort.
Absolutely. Because you could take this parable that one son goes to church, but he's a hellion in terms of how he lives, and the other son doesn't go to church, but loves his neighbor. I mean, you could do the parable that way, and you say, which is doing the will of the Father, and it would come out the same way. Well, the one who's actually loving the neighbor, whether he's going to church or not. That's kind of the same. That's what I'm getting at, is how do I measure things up in my own mind? Like, what is important? Derek, you had a...
Yeah, well, I think it's kind of ironic that we're like talking about this, so our teaching is to emphasize praxis and not, you know, de-emphasize teaching. So I'm curious, especially coming from you, that, because I think you've taught me a lot about the emphasis on knowledge being the root of sin. How do you relate the role of learning and of doctrine, for lack of a better word, but of understanding these things to the principles you're talking about here?
Yeah, well, to try and give away everything I'm going to be talking about over the next few weeks. You're right on target. You're where I'm headed.
Banish fear of that.
No, but you're right. That's where I'm headed. And so, you know, so the way I've said it, some of you have been here for years and you've heard me say that, you know, maybe you recall that the whole, we don't plan and implement, but we experiment and reflect. Well, there's still some talk, obviously, that goes on about how are we going to experiment. And there's some teaching, like, because you have to choose a relatively good experiment. Like, well, what are we going to try, right? And so that's informed. But you know that the real outcome is when you sit down and debrief afterwards. That's where you gain the real benefit, because you don't know what you don't know, and you don't know until you put it into practice. So it sounds like everything sounds like a good idea until you try and do it. So that's why if you hold it lightly and say, this is simply an experiment that we're going to try, if it doesn't go well, we won't do it again. It's like, was this what we're going to do from now on? I don't know. If it's great, then maybe it will be. But if it's horrible, then we'll say, tried that, not doing that again, right? There's teaching, there's discussion, there's talk all through the process, but it's where we recognize the real benefit comes. It comes from us reflecting on what we were taught from the doing. And that's where the knowledge is gained. So it's the knowledge of experience, not the knowledge that is basically hearsay. It's hard fought knowledge of, I know this because I've done it, not I know this because I've been told it. And that's, I would say, a big difference. And personal knowledge, if you know the book by Michael Polanyi, I think it's of that title, Personal Knowledge. It's the knowledge that is unshakable. Like, I know I love my wife. You will not convince me otherwise. You could even point out where I've acted horribly or been uncaring or something. It will not shake my belief is I know I love her. I may not be able to convince you I do, which I really couldn't, because you can be endlessly skeptical. No, you're just manipulative. You just want me to think you love you. You can doubt everything I would try and put forth as proof that I love my wife. There's nothing I could do to convince you of that, because you could always dismiss it. But I know it. It's personal knowledge because it's experiential. When we start realizing that the real deep knowledge is experiential, which, if you remember, that's why I said we don't prove God, God proves himself. When God proves God's self, no one can shake that. You know what you know. You've experienced it. My complaint about that earlier was people alleging they could set up a proof for me apart from experience that would satisfy me. And it did not work, which made me skeptical about that they even were talking about anything necessarily true, because they alleged it was a proof, and I could find it lacking. But when a person experiences something, be it a burning bush or whatever, and that can take all sorts of shapes and ways, as much as God is personal, then that then becomes something because again, it's based on experience. Is that helping a little bit? But we're headed in the direction. I want to develop this more and more over the next few weeks. Exactly what you're saying. How does this play out?
It's being taught by God.
Yes. Yeah, it's God as teacher. It's Jesus as master. He is rabbi. And you learn through experience with the master. And so we get together and we have these times where we talk and they're all valuable, but without practice, they're all useless. If you don't do anything, if each of us don't do anything about what we talk about, and we're talking about something experiential, and hypothetical until you do it. We can talk endlessly about loving your neighbor, but until you step out of your comfort zone and try and love someone who is your neighbor, and Jesus says that's anybody who's near to you, they're your neighbor. If you've never done that, it all remains hypothetical until you do it. And then you ask yourself, well, what did I experience when I went and did something I'd never done before? What did I learn by that? Okay, Daryl, and then I'll come to Edwin.
I'll just make a short statement.
Yeah.
In a way, you could set up a false dichotomy here.
Yes.
Where you could say, you could actually have good orthodoxy and good orthopraxy together. They don't actually separate.
Exactly. Well, and that's why I started with the whole thing about a false dichotomy, and you could say Jesus is doing a false dichotomy, because I know you're not, but I'm glad you're pointing that out. Some people would push back against what I'm saying because they don't like the idea that if you had to prioritize, orthopraxy really is more important than orthodoxy. And so they not liking that, they'll say, well, really, they go together. But they just want to turn it back the other way and say they go together, right? But that's because they still want orthodoxy to rule, to be a first priority.
Well, there's a sense in which there's something to that, right? Because you have to have the right mentality to experience things fully, right? You have to experiment and reflect. You have to approach it that way, right? So there's it's kind of meta, but you need to not worship the conclusion, but the process. And
Right.
you have to have a conclusion to trust the process.
Yeah. No, you and maybe what we mean by orthodoxy is kind of a fixed and settled idea where, like you're saying, we need the mentality of an openness to a possibility. So the idea of experimenting and then reflecting, a person will only engage in if they're open to the possibility, maybe there's more here than I have previously known. If you're closed down to that, well, I know everything I need to know. Well, obviously any idea of experiment and reflect is going to be already ridiculous to you because, to that person, because they've learned it all. So yeah, there has to be a mentality, but the mentality is not quite the same as the orthodoxy, like a held belief. The mentality is one like, or as you've heard me say it before, we hold our beliefs lightly. It's not because they're not important. It's because I know I may be required to alter that belief, so I don't grip it so tightly. I'm not changing. Well, I thought Samaritans were wrong. Well, Jesus tells me a parable, and I had to hold whatever beliefs I have lightly enough that the master can school me and teach me something different. I have to always be open to that possibility that I can experience. Okay, Edwina?
So, well, I'm sort of slow, so I always say I never make the same mistake the third time. I am called on people to consult occasionally about nonprofits and things. And what I always say is, I'm telling you this so you won't step in the same hole that I stepped in and
Yeah.
sprain my, So if I tell you about my mistake, this might stop you from making the same mistake. Because heaven knows, I made a lot of mistakes.
Yeah.
Happy to admit it and happy to still be upright.
Yeah, and that's the knowledge of experience, of having tried things, found out what worked and what didn't, right? But we can theorize about what will work, but until we try and put it into practice, we really never know. And then you find out, well, and it's usually nuanced. It partly worked and partly didn't. And then you modify. That's why you experiment, and then you reflect, and then you construct basically a new version of the experiment. But you're always experimenting. There's always an ongoing process. All right, so let's look at two passages, and then we're going to have lunch. Where I like to go when I'm starting with a new subject is Sermon on the Mount. Because if you don't start with Jesus, and you don't start with the core of what Jesus is saying, which is the Sermon on the Mount, then I think we've kind of missed the place to begin. I like to start with Jesus, the Sermon on the Mount, branch out from there, Paul as commentary on Jesus. So if I go to Sermon on the Mount, where do I see orthopraxy taking precedent over orthodoxy? You could say pretty much the whole Sermon on the Mount is about practice. But let me just point out a few very blatant instances, because Jesus never says in the Sermon on the Mount, I want you to believe that my Father is omniscient, omnipotent, and omnipresent. He never said, or I want you to believe that I was born of a virgin, or you need to believe, he never gives them beliefs. He's always talking about how they practice prayers, almsgiving, treating their neighbors, do they judge them? It's all about practice. But notice a couple things. So starting at the beginning, Matthew 5:16, familiar verse, but just notice the word, let your light shine before men in such a way that they may see your good works and glorify your Father who is in heaven. Right? It's not hear your pristine doctrines, but see your good practice. But how much has the church spent its time proclaiming its, doctrines to the world? These are the beliefs that make you Christian. These are the things that we preach to the world. You must believe this to become a Christian. Jesus doesn't start there. He starts with, show them the way you live. That's your light. Right? Just what he's saying. And if you go down to, we can't do the next one because the next one involves, I'll raise it and then we'll pick it up next week. So the next one involves 5:19, but I want to explore how this might actually play out. Well, no, it'll work a little bit, but 19 and 20. 19, whoever then annuls one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same shall be called least in the kingdom of heaven, but whoever keeps and teaches them, he shall be called great in the kingdom of heaven. Notice the order. Keeps and teaches. The criticism is about those who teach, and if you teach not to keep something, well, then that's obviously, he's saying, a problem. But he says, you keep and you teach. He puts first the practice, then the teaching. I think that's significant. The next part that we'll pick up is 20. Then he says, so your righteousness must exceed that of the scribes and Pharisees. What's he saying there? Okay, that's where we'll pick it up next week. And we'll look at some more places where he keeps emphasizing practice has to come first. All right. Thanks for the comments and the class time, and we're going to have a meal if you can stay for it. Go in peace.